Do you remember as a child, either you saying these words or hearing one of your friends say these words, I have a secret, and then perhaps being as we were as children, we would immediately share that secret. Well, something similar happens with the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians. And it's an interesting thing that he says, and we're going to discuss briefly why it's interesting. But let me read these words, and then we will discuss it. Starting with verse 14 of Philippians chapter 4. Philippians 4:14. Yet it was kind of you to share my troubles, and you Philippians, I'm sorry, I started a little bit late. Start with verse 10, not 14. That was really good information there, starting with verse 14, but it's not what I was wanting. Start with verse 10 of Philippians chapter 4. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am in to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, when you hear those words of Paul the Apostle, without knowing the situation that he is going through right now as he's writing those words to the church in Philippi, you're missing something greatly. Paul the Apostle is in prison. If you look at Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 12 through 14, you come to find out that's his situation. This is one of his prison epistles, it's oftentimes called. And so notice, Paul the Apostle is in a situation where his movement has been encroached on. He has been forced to stay in one place. Can you see why during this virus that I've thought about doing this as a lesson? Paul the Apostle, because of the government, is being forced to stay in this case, prison. Now, there's a lot of question about whether this was a cold, dark, dank prison, or whether this is talking about what it was much like at the end of the book of Acts, the first time he was imprisoned, perhaps being in a house arrest situation. But whatever the situation, his movement, his freedom has been encroached upon. And when you read the book of Philippians, except for him telling you this, except for him mentioning it as he goes along, you wouldn't know it. Paul the Apostle is not woe is me. Paul the Apostle is not rankling on the fact that he has been limited. But instead, he says, I've got a secret. There's a secret reason, a reason that I am able to get through this. And then he shares the secret, as I said a few moments ago, much like we did when we were children with each other, when we had a secret. He says in those words, in that first part of it, first that he was grateful that they were concerned about him, but he wanted to let them know something right off the bat. I am not in need. Now, again, what about your freedom, Paul? Don't you need that? What about your ability to reach out to people in various ways that you're now limited from doing? Don't you need that? Well, Paul was able to write a letter to the church of Philippi. He may certainly not have been able to walk the streets and try to find people to convert. It would seem in there, in fact, when you get to the end of chapter 4, when he says, those in Caesar's household send their greetings. Do you know who those in Caesar's household probably are he's talking about? The guards who were caring for Paul. If he was in a situation that was a little bit more restraining, he may have very well been chained to some guards. Well, guess what happens when you're chained to the Apostle Paul? Well, you learn about God. It may very well be that some of those guards that he was chained to, if he was chained to them, at least those who were guarding him, may very well have become Christians. Because Paul the Apostle saw his opportunities where he was. He did not allow his being limited to limit him in taking the gospel, at least to those who are around him. And so when he says those words, I want to reiterate those words. He says, not that I am speaking of being in need. Now, we mentioned there's a lot of things he could have needed. But we recognize where Paul's focus was. And we talk a little bit more about this focus idea on Sunday in the sermon. I don't want to steal from it. But his focus was on the most important. And what wasn't in need for the Apostle Paul was his soul. His soul was not in need. He had everything he needed for his soul's well-being. God was with him. God had saved him. He was continually being under the grace of God our Father. And so with Paul the Apostle, he has no needs. And we see that when he says these words. It doesn't matter what his situation around him was like. Look at how he says, I know how to be brought low. He had been brought low. He was in prison. And I know how to abound. In different times in his lives, he had abounded. People were encouraged by him. He would have people listening to his lessons. He would have people who, when he was on his way to Jerusalem on his final missionary journey, who wept because they were afraid they were never going to see him again. He had people who loved him. So he knows how to be brought low. He knows how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And notice what that secret is with the very next verse. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. You know, that is truly the way to make it through any situation. We have been doing this series of lessons for this past week about the situation that we're all in. I see a lot of funny. In fact, I've put many of them on my Facebook page, memes of what it's like to be cooped up. And I enjoy that, and I think sometimes humor is a good way to get through things. But you know, a better way, or an additional way, not that you have to separate either one of them, but an additional way of getting through that is to think about what's truly important, to realize how God has so much blessed you. There's one particular meme I saw that had a lot of preaching to it. You know, if you're so worried about being cooped up in your house, remember that you have the blessing of having a house. You have a blessing of a place to be cooped up in. Wouldn't it be a sad thing to be homeless during a time period like this? Can you imagine? Wouldn't it be a scary thing to be told you can't move from where? I don't have anywhere not to move from. But you and I have a place to stay. We have comforts of our home. We have electricity. We have gas. We have heat. We have air conditioning if we need it. We have every situation basically for our prison, if you want to call it that, to be a very nice prison. You know, the negative way of looking at that is, this is a prison. The positive way of looking at it is, this isn't a prison like Paul had. And Paul didn't look at his situation as in a negative way. Let's be people who consider what's most important. And let's realize in verse 13 what he says again, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. We can get through this because Jesus is with us. There are people who are in worse situations that we are in that can get through this when Jesus is with them. There are people who are in much better situations than we are. And in some ways, that can be just as difficult. When you're not in need of Jesus, sometimes it's easy to forget him. But people who are doing well off can even get through that when Jesus is with them. Let's remember what's most important. Let's remember how Paul dealt with the difficult. And let's try to be followers as Christ would have us to be.